All right, so you're ready for a deep dive, huh? Looks like JavaScript's on the menu today.
You got it. And from what I see, you want to really get your hands dirty with the practical stuff like loops, functions, arrays, that sort of thing.
Right on. I mean, those are kind of the backbone of any good program, right?
Absolutely, they are.
The study guide, though? Whoa, there's a lot in there.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to cover.
But hey, that's what we're here for, right? To help sort through it all and really pinpoint those super essential things.
That's exactly it. Think of us as your coding chefs. We're here to break down those complex recipes into something you can actually digest.
I love that. So first up, we got to talk loops, right? I mean, they're everywhere in code anytime you're doing something repetitive.
Right. And there's a good reason for that. They help you automate those tasks. Think of it like this. If you're baking a cake, you wouldn't crack each egg individually right.
No way.
You'd use a loop to repeat that cracking action for every egg you need. Loops are all about efficiency in your code.
Makes sense.
And just like there are different ways to crack an egg, you could use one hand, two hands, a special tool. There are different types of loops in JavaScript.
Okay, cool.
Each one's kind of designed for a specific situation.
So let's start with the for loop. This one seems to be like the workhorse, right?
Yeah.
When you know exactly how many times you need to do something.
Yeah, you got it. Like going through your ingredient list, checking off each item one by one. The for loop's your go-to for that kind of predictable repetition.
So if I need to like process each element in an array, the for loop would be the way to go.
Exactly. You tell the loop where to start, where to stop, and how much to jump by each time.
Okay, so it's very controlled.
Very controlled. But what about when you don't know exactly how many times you need to repeat something?
Right. Like, I don't know, stirring batter until it's smooth. You don't know how many stirs it'll take beforehand. You just keep going until it's, right. Perfect example. That's where the while loop comes in.
Oh, it keeps running as long as a certain condition is true. So you could say, keep stirring the batter while it's still lumpy.
I see. So it's like, keep doing this until this happens.
Exactly. The study guide even uses that classic example of counting to 10 with a while loop, just to illustrate how it works.
Remember that. Pretty straightforward.
It is, but it gets the point across, shows you how that condition is what drives the loop.
Right, right. Now, there's also that do-while loop, right? I always find that one a little
tricky.
Yeah, a little tricky. It's like, why would you do it that way?
Yeah, well, the thing with do while is it guarantees that the code inside the loop runs at least once, even if the condition's false from the start.
So it's like, even if the oven's already preheated, you're going to preheat it again, just to be sure.
Well, not exactly. Think of it more like you always grease the pan no matter what you're baking. It's that one step that always happens first.
Ah, okay, that makes more sense.
The guide uses that counting to 10 example again, but with do while, to show that even though you're counting to 10, you're still going to execute that first count, no matter what.
So that do part of it is basically saying, hey, do this first, then check the condition.
You got it. And that can be super useful in certain situations where you need that guaranteed first run.
Okay. So just like a good chef knows when to use a whisk versus a spatula, a programmer needs to know which loop is the right tool for the job.
Exactly. Using the right loop can make your code way more efficient and elegant, just like a well-executed recipe.
Awesome. Okay, so we've conquered loops, at least for now. What about functions? Those seem like the real workhorses of JavaScript.
They are. If loops are like our mixers and blenders, functions are those trusty kitchen appliances that each have their own special job. You wouldn't use a blender to chop vegetables, right?
Definitely not.
So functions let you encapsulate a block of code, give it a name, and then reuse it anytime you need to perform that specific task. It's all about modularity and reusability.
It's like having pre-chopped onions ready to go whenever you need them.
Precisely. And the study guide kicks things off with function declarations. It's the classic, straightforward way to define a function.
I remember they used that greet function as an example where you give it a name and it spits out a greeting. Simple but effective.
It is. Function declarations are like those reliable, everyday appliances, always there when you need them.
Easy to understand, too.
Exactly. And then you've got function expressions, which are a bit more, expressive.
More like a multi-purpose food processor, maybe?
Yeah, I like that. You can assign a function to a variable, giving you more flexibility in how you use it. Like you can store different ingredients in the same container depending on what you're making.
So different functions, same result, just a different way of writing it.
Exactly. The guide uses that same greet example to show how you can achieve the same outcome with both function declarations and expressions.
Cool. So it's really about choosing the style that fits your needs and your coding personality.
Absolutely. And as you get more comfortable, you'll start to see how you can use functions to really make your code modular and reusable. Like you can even have functions talking to each other, passing information back and forth.
Whoa, that sounds pretty advanced.
It's not as complicated as it sounds, trust me. And then, of course, you have the arrow functions.
Oh, yes, the new kid on the block, the fancy, sleek appliance that everyone's raving about.
That's a great way to put it. They're a more concise way to write functions, especially for those simple one-line tasks. They're like having a super efficient garlic press, one swift motion, and you're done.
So whether you choose a classic function declaration, a flexible function expression, or a streamlined arrow function, remember that functions are all about organizing and reusing your code. It's like building a well-stocked kitchen, ready to tackle any recipe.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, how about we move on to arrays? They're like those pantry shelves, keeping all your ingredients organized and ready to go.
And speaking of organization, there are those handy array methods, right? They seem like real time savers.
Oh, they definitely are. Instead of chopping every vegetable individually, you can use these methods to streamline all those common tasks. They're like having a team of sous chefs, each specializing in a specific technique.
I like the sound of that. So first up, we have .map. It's like that magic slicer that preps all your veggies in one go.
Perfect analogy, .map. Lets you transform each item in an array in a consistent way. The guide uses that example of doubling numbers in an array.
Right. You tell it how to change each element, and .map does all the heavy lifting.
And the cool part is it creates a brand new array with those transformed elements, leaving the original array untouched. So you've got your prepped veggies in one bowl and the originals in another, all nice and organized.
Nice. Okay, then there's .filter. I bet I can guess what this one does.
Go ahead, give it a shot.
It's like sifting flour, right? You get rid of the lumps and keep only the fine stuff.
You nailed it. @filter lets you pick out only the elements that meet a certain condition. The example in the guide shows how to filter for even numbers.
Okay, so you set the rule, like, only keep the numbers divisible by 2, and filter takes care of the rest.
Precisely. It's super useful for extracting specific data from an array.
Makes sense. Okay, last but not least, we have .reduce. This one sounds a little more mysterious.
Well, think of it like simmering a pot of ingredients into a delicious sauce. You're taking a whole array and boiling it down to a single value.
Okay, so it's like the master combiner.
You got it. And it's incredibly versatile. You can use it to sum numbers, combine strings, really anything that involves taking multiple elements and turning them into one.
I see. The guide uses that example of adding up all the numbers in an array, right?
Right. Reduce goes through the array step by step, combining each element with the previous result until you're left with the final sum.
It's like adding each ingredient to the pot one by one until you have that perfect blend of flavors.
Exactly. Master these three, .map, .filter, and reduce, and you'll be a true array wizard.
Wizardry. I like it. All right, so now that we've prepped our ingredients and blended them to perfection, it's time to add a little logic to our code, right?
You bet. Let's talk conditionals, specifically if-else statements. They're like those key instructions in a recipe that say, if the dough is sticky, then add more flour.
Right, so it's all about making decisions in our code. Like, if this happens, do this, otherwise do that.
Precisely. Conditionals give your program the ability to adapt and respond differently based on certain conditions. It's what makes your code dynamic and intelligent.
The study guide has that basic example where it checks if a number is greater than 10. It's simple, but it shows how those if statements work.
Exactly. Without conditionals, programs would be pretty boring, just following the same instructions every time. Conditionals let you add that if this, then that logic that makes things interesting.
So it makes our code smart, I guess.
Exactly. It's what gives it the power to make decisions and respond to different situations.
Cool. Okay, so last but not least, we got to talk about rejects. I know it sounds intimidating, but it's really not that scary once you get the hang of it.
You're right. Think of rejects, or regular expressions, as a super-powered find and replace tool. But instead of searching for exact words, you can search for patterns.
Patterns.
Yep, patterns in text. Like, say, you want to find all email addresses in a document, or maybe all phone numbers that follow a specific format.
Ah, okay. So it's more than just finding specific words. It's about finding things that fit a certain structure.
Exactly. The guide starts with a simple example of finding the word hello in a string, just to illustrate the basic idea of matching patterns.
I remember that. It seemed pretty basic at first, but then I realized how powerful it could be.
Oh, absolutely. Regex is incredibly powerful for validating user input, extracting information from text, and all sorts of other tasks. It's a whole world unto itself, but don't let that scare you. Even a basic understanding can be super useful.
So it's like a secret weapon for working with text.
You could say that. It's definitely a tool worth having in your coding arsenal.
All right, and finally, there's this for each thing. I wasn't quite sure what to make of that one.
Well, for each is another way to work with arrays, but it's a bit more direct than something like map. Instead of creating a new array, it focuses on performing an action on each element of the original array.
So it's like, I don't know, taking each ingredient and doing something specific to it, but not necessarily changing the ingredient itself.
Exactly. The guide uses the example of logging each item in an array to the console. It's a simple illustration, but it shows how you can use for each to process each element without creating a new array.
So it's like, I'm looking at each ingredient, maybe taking note of it, but not actually changing it.
That's a great way to think about it. It's handy for tasks like displaying items on a web page or performing actions on each element without needing to create a new array.
Got it. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from loops to functions, array methods, conditionals, a taste of regex, and even another way to work with arrays with for each. It's like we've gone through a whole cooking course in just one sitting.
We have, and these are just the fundamental ingredients, the building blocks of any good JavaScript program. With these under your belt, you're well on your way to creating amazing things.
It's like we've learned how to chop, sauté, and simmer. Now it's time to start experimenting with those skills and creating our own culinary masterpieces.
Exactly. The fun is just beginning.
And speaking of fun, I think it's time for a little break. We'll be back in a bit to delve even deeper into the world of JavaScript.
You know, it's like now that we've got all those basic techniques down, it's time to start combining them, you know?
Right, because, I mean, knowing how to use a loop is great, but it's when you start using a loop inside a function or combining different array methods, that's when things get really interesting.
Exactly. That's where the real power of JavaScript comes in. It's not just about knowing the individual pieces, it's about understanding how they fit together, how they can work together to solve problems.
So we're not just learning a language, we're learning a way of thinking, a way of, like, approaching problems and breaking them down to smaller, more manageable steps.
You got it. And with each concept you master, you're adding another tool to your coding toolbox.
Yeah, I can see that. But I gotta admit, sometimes looking at a blank code editor can be a bit daunting. You know, it's like, where do I even start?
I totally get it. Everyone feels that way at first. The key is to start small. Don't try to build a whole website or a complex app right away. Just play around with the concepts we've covered. Experiment, see what works, what doesn't work.
So, like, write little snippets of code, try different things out, don't be afraid to break things.
Exactly. That's how you learn. And remember, every expert programmer was once a beginner, making mistakes and figuring things out along the way.
All right, we all got to start somewhere. And speaking of mistakes, what about debugging? I mean, that's like an inevitable part of coding, right?
Oh yeah, debugging is a huge part of the process. No matter how experienced you are, you're going to run into bugs in your code. Like, it comes with the territory.
And sometimes those bugs can be so frustrating, like, why isn't this working the way it's supposed to?
I know the feeling, but the good news is there are ways to track down those bugs and squash them. Think of it like being a detective. You got to examine the clues, analyze the evidence, and use your logic to figure out what's going wrong.
Yeah, it's like a puzzle. You got to figure out which piece is out of place.
Exactly. And the study guide doesn't really dive into specific debugging tools, but there are tons of resources out there, both online and within your code editor, that can help you.
Right, like, I know my code editor has a debugger built in, but I haven't really used it much.
Well, it's definitely worth exploring. A debugger can be super helpful for stepping through your code line by line and seeing what's happening at each step.
So it's like slowing down the recipe and watching each step happen in slow motion.
Exactly. And sometimes the best way to debug is to just talk through your code with someone else. Explain what you're trying to do, what each line of code is supposed to accomplish. Often, just by explaining it out loud, you'll catch those errors you missed before. It's like having a fresh pair of eyes on the problem.
Yeah, I've definitely had that experience. Like, I'll be stuck on something for hours, and then I explain to a friend, and suddenly the solution is obvious.
It happens all the time. And remember, debugging isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of growth. Every bug you fix is a learning opportunity, a chance to deepen your understanding and become a more skilled developer.
So embrace those bugs. There are teachers in disguise.
I love that. Bugs as teachers, that's a great way to look at it. And now that we've covered so much ground in this deep dive, it's important to remember that we've only just scratched the surface of what JavaScript can do.
Right. It's like we've learned the basics of cooking, but there's a whole world of culinary techniques and cuisines out there waiting to be explored.
Exactly. You could delve deeper into front-end development with frameworks like React or Angular, or explore back-end development with Node.js, or even branch out into other programming languages entirely. The possibilities are pretty much endless.
Wow, it's kind of overwhelming, but also exciting at the same time.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
It can feel like there's so much to learn and not enough time. But the key is to just keep learning, keep experimenting, and most importantly, keep having fun.
Right. Find something that excites you, a project that you're passionate about, and just dive in. You might be surprised at what you can create.
And you don't have to go it alone. The JavaScript community is huge and incredibly welcoming. There are tons of online resources, forums, and communities where you can connect with other learners, ask questions, share your projects, and get inspiration from others.
So it's like having a network of fellow chefs to collaborate with,
Mm.
share recipes, and learn from each other's experiences.
Exactly. Collaboration can really accelerate your learning and expose you to different perspectives and approaches. And you never know, you might even make some great friends along the way.
Yeah, that's one of the best things about coding, the community. It's so
Yeah.
supportive and encouraging.
For sure. Because at the end of the day, coding isn't just about writing instructions for computers. It's about connecting with other humans, sharing ideas, and building something amazing together.
I love that. So what's the final word? What should our listeners take away from all this?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that anyone can learn to code. It's not about being a math genius or having some special talent. It's about curiosity, persistence, and a willingness to learn and experiment.
And don't forget to have fun along the way.
Yeah.
Coding should be enjoyable, not a chore.
Absolutely. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong.
So there you have it, folks. The world of JavaScript is waiting for you. Go forth and code.
Happy coding.
At the end of the day, it really comes down to you.
Yeah, your passion, your willingness to keep learning and exploring, that's what'll take you far.
We've given you a taste, right? Like the essential ingredients, the basic technique.
The foundation.
Exactly, the foundation. But now it's your turn to take those and really run with them.
Experiment,
Push the boundaries, see what you can create.
Exactly.
So go out there and code with confidence.
The world of JavaScript, it's waiting for you.
Happy coding, everyone.